So I'll just try to introduce Fernand in a few words and then I'll hand over to him to take us through his roller coaster. So I think Fernand, in my mind, is probably the best person to kick this off because of his, I think, this like insane latitude in terms of everything that he's interested in. So while he has multiple day jobs, he also has multiple night jobs, like proper Bruce Wayne kind of character. So I think, I mean, I've known Fernand since we moved to Goa. We have a few common friends as well. And I think he teaches regularly at the Goa College and he is heading the urban design program there. And he also runs Studio Woodpecker, which is a Goa-based architecture design, furniture design, urban craft studio. So they do a fair amount of work from like very large projects to furniture. And I think that kind of macro to micro approach is really interesting to see because you can spot like a Studio Woodpecker bar stool somewhere in a brewery and then you would suddenly see like some mapping projects of miles in Goa. So this is like a huge latitude that he very almost effortlessly inhabits. So that's been one of the things that I've admired most about his practice. He's also alumni of the Michigan College, so he's an ex-student of Perry's, and that brings like a fair amount of rigor to the architecture and design practice as well. He's also an author. He wrote this really amazing book on the church and convent in Chimbel in Goa, for people who are familiar with that part, it's got a very interesting history. And I think through Fernand's and his partner Sid, through their scholarship, it put a very nice spotlight on that particular monument. And it's become a kind of I would say, a point of resistance as well for the community around Chimbel, because for the long time, I think once things are not documented, there is very few things for the community to rally around. So I think his initial scholarship created this point of interest around Chimbel, which was very interesting for us to see also the evolution of how that document has now become part of public discourse and things like that. And this is something he spoke about very evocatively when he was starting the project as well, that once you don't have documentation, things are very easy to bulldoze over and by the sort of vested powers. There's also one other side of Fernand, which is probably the Batman side of it, is like the Goa Collective. So we are also partners in something called Goa Collective, which is trying to do more work in the public domain. And the idea is to, during COVID, we did a few water installation designs. There were a few public space design projects at that point. And we're also doing a lot of writing around things that plague Goa and Goan society at large. I think with that, I think what's really happening is I feel like his lens is really interesting to look at terrain. Like how do you actually look at a landscape? And I feel like because of his approach, a lot of clarity emerges in the way we read landscapes. And he's able to actually spot contestations. He's able to spot like ecological movements. He's able to actually see community very clearly, people who inhabit these landscapes. So I feel in some of his extremely sensitive and nuanced documentation, you actually find a fair amount of understanding of all these different layers that exist on a terrain. So with that, thank you so much, Fernand, for agreeing to this.
Thank you for the very generous introduction. And I just want to share today some of the successes I have encountered in my journey as an architect. And to be clear, they are few and far between when it comes to mobilizing citizens. But the few successes that I have had, has had an enormous impact on Goan society. And this journey began when I finally returned to Goa in 2017 after many years abroad. And I was lost as an architect. And then I had to discover Goa again because though I am from Goa and born and brought up over here, the state has changed a lot and my family is dispersed across the globe. And so I came back to Goa and I was a bit disillusioned also. So then one of the ways of getting to know Goa is I also began reading about its history in a more academic way. And what one understands about Goa's terrain is that it's a colonial terrain, but it's also a colonial terrain of a pre-modern empire. So it's not a post-Renaissance industrial empire. It is pre-modern, and it's a pre-modern European empire. So in which the manner in which they start making sense of the terrain is through maps and writings. And if you see the map here, it's 1634. And then it's a kind of colonial way of understanding Goa. But the wonderful thing is that there is an archive. And most of India, does not have an archive rigorous in that sense. And this is one of the challenges of Goa's identity. It's a kind of transnational identity. So if you look at this map, it's 1834, it's 1634, but there are maps from like the 16th century. And what one gets to understand from the readings and looking at these maps, it's one hierarchical class society trying to map another hierarchical class society. So it's one center of power engaging with other systems of power located very far away. This could be another lecture in itself, but the Goa archive is one of the richest archives in Asia by far, and a lot of it still exists. Okay, so then how does this impact my journey now? Because I'm not a scholar of pre-modern Goa. So so I was working in Mumbai after I graduated from the Goa College of Architecture, and I learned Photoshop. This was 2005. And so there's something called a regional plan in Goa. And a regional plan is a land use plan. And so basically Goa was urbanizing in a rapid manner, and there was lots of money to be made. So there wasn't a sense of community engagement. It was just the minister and a bunch of cohorts of his began creating this plan by literally taking a box of crayons and coloring over the landscape. So then I took a break from Mumbai, I came back to Goa, and so I knew Photoshop at this point. And I began helping this group of architects, trying to make sense of what the landscape would look like if they went through with this plan. And there was no WhatsApp and Facebook, I think, had just come. But just sharing these images, people started getting really agitated. And then I realized, oh, there's a huge power in Photoshop. And like people started getting agitated to the point that discussion started happening in the public sphere. And so this was one of the public facing renderings that this group of architects, which included me, were doing. It was done in the office of Dean de Cruz and Rebani Saha, and I was working like pro bono. And we came up with these images. But on the back of the images, there was some rigorous data that was also being crunched. So it wasn't just frivolous images being put out in the public sphere, but it was also like architectural and urban analysis in the form of reports that in the form of a report that we made. And if you see the way in which this regional plan was made, it shows a food park on top to the right. And below it, it's actually advertising for a 800 villa luxury golf course. This was 2006, 2005. The regional plan was. So then we began studying these details. We began studying these changes in a refined manner, if I may use the word. What were the consequences of the bylaws and on Goa's landscape? We began doing this, and then we began also going around the villages and putting this up on a projector, a PowerPoint presentation. I've literally not touched this presentation. I've copied the slides in from 2006, 20 years ago, and just literally dumped them here. And if you see the hills behind, we photomontaged them with whatever tools we had at that point. Okay. And we went to the villages and we began just putting this out there. And what began happening at that point, oh, sorry for the slide, Goa started becoming a terrain in which you started having casinos, and it began becoming a terrain of tourism consumption. Before that, it was more or less a terrain of mining extraction. Why is this happening in Goa specifically? One has to look at you have to look at the terrain from the point of view of societies that are not part of central nationalism, cannot really integrate into the countries in which they become part of. Macau, Goa, I would say also Hawaii, the US. They're not born of the nationalism of that country. So then they become peripheral territories. And peripheral territories are generally consumed then by either extractive policies of removing minerals or whatever agricultural goods, etc., or they are places of consumption. And then Goa was becoming that. It was becoming moving away from a territory of extraction to a territory in which you started having consumption. And these are the ways in which larger societies, then larger national frameworks, begin to control societies like this. You started having like this casino culture that's coming, and it's no secret that Macau has exactly the same thing. And the context of China historically is very different, politically, socially, but they also have a big tourism culture. And these were both Portuguese terrains that were absorbed by giant post-colonial societies. So you have to see this Goa's position within two frameworks. One is the Portuguese colonial framework, but one is a post-colonial framework in which it's a marginal territory and a territory that is controlled through land. Just few months ago, I would say, from 2006 to 2026, something like this came out. So it was unabashed. Like it was Delhi, rulers of India, now conquer Goa. But it wasn't even trying to hide that there was or whatever, that you are part of the national mainstream, etc. It was like saying it as it is. You also started seeing advertisements out like this, in which Goa was then being sold as a escape for the rest of the country, but it was also being sold as an escape from the point of view of tourism consumption. Tourism consumption and real estate consumption. They go hand in hand, actually. Okay, what then happens is that Goa's land movements then are quite different from the rest of the country. It is because of the manner in which the territory is associated with the rest of the country. Agitations around land, etc., tend to be extremely well organized. And this gives a lot of opportunities for a diverse set of class groups in Goa to engage as a whole in order to come around issues that are generally almost not religious. They are civic issues. And you have a large grouping of people coming together and demanding kind of political change. Okay? How does one, as an architect, then begin assisting in community organizing? And this is something that I have learned slowly, and I've learned over a period of 10 years. And this is something I really want to share with the younger architects, because many times we feel that we have really good ideas, but then these ideas go nowhere. Then how does one take these ideas and bring it to the public sphere and begin organizing around these ideas in order for these ideas to get implemented? Okay, so great ideas come to many people. How they are implemented happens to, if they are ever implemented, you are the lucky one. Okay, so one needs to understand that you have to understand the manner in which our profession is situated. If you are an architect, okay, you are disconnected from the grassroots trades and grassroots communities. You are now a professional. And as a professional, you tend to be disassociated with society, the manner in which the profession is structured. Any profession, doctor, lawyer, architect, etc. You are seen as a source of ideas, but you are not seen as being part of a larger community of citizens in the point of view of communicating, communicating and working with this group of citizens. Okay. In order to then be a citizen architect, one needs to just come down from the ladder a bit and try not to be a leader, and then be a support staff or a team player, somebody who works from the backgrounds and whose input has enormous value. Then how did this movement, which actually started as a kind of book project, begin acquiring such enormous political churnings in Goa? Okay, if you are following the news or recently about Goa, the state has become restive that it's almost these street agitations seem like they're going to dislodge the government, the legitimately elected government, because of this kind of neoliberal approach to land that the government is taking. So now, close to the site where I began my first mapping, you're going to have this massive mall being built close to a lake. And the lake and the surroundings of the lake were used by the tribal community. But the way in which Goa's land laws are is that the land was used, but they were not owners of the land. So the government said, we're going to build a mall there. And then there was this massive agitation that took place. And a lot of the data that I had created with my friend then became very useful to this agitation without me like being the face of this. Okay, so how did this begin? It began by a simple mapping project. So this was agitation that took over all of Goa. Means all parts of Goa came together and they started marching to the house of the minister. But my project actually, I think Hussein and Ayaz have seen this before, started as a very simple mapping project. There was this ruin of a church that then became a hospice for abandoned women, and then later became a mental institution. So Goa's history is very much, it starts with religious institutions that then become secular and then become institutions of the state. Quite a few of them are in ruins. And my first project was then mapping these ruins. It wasn't about community organizing or anything of that order. The mapping project finally led to a book. And in the book, we went a little broader. What we did was we looked at the layers of the historical layers of this structure, but we also began then mapping the village. Like we went a step further because Goa, the archives are not in good condition, though it's a fantastic archive. A lot of the material is not very accessible to people. What we did was we did a broader mapping of the village from the archive and through archives in Portugal and the UK because of Goa's history. You cannot just look at the archives in Goa. So then we wrote a history of the village, as much as information that we could get. And then there were these fabulous bits of information that we were able to find. But we also came to the present and we highlighted the assets within the broader village. And if to the right you can see there's a lake over there. And this was the lake then that led to the minister almost like losing his job. Okay, so this lake has been mapped, but we also mapped the other assets of the village very broadly, the informal settlements that began adjoining the village, etc. Okay, before this spiraled into a statewide movement, in 2020, so 3 years into this project, I was able to, through a series of backroom support, I was able to support a local group that was able to declare this monument a state protected monument based on the data that we had created, me and my collaborator, Dr. Sid Mendirata, at that time. And it was the first time that, based on data and mapping, that a state monument, the list of state monuments, were opened up, and the state said, okay, we're going to add this monument to the list. So the first time since 1987. So how does one achieve such a thing? Because the list was assumed to be closed. Okay, this was absolutely unusual. But the whole process is something I want to share with you. And maybe it's something you could learn from also. Is the state declared this, and something that they thought was almost like civil society thought was almost impossible. So, how did I start this project? I received a site like this, and there wasn't much that existed on the site. So, if a site this vulnerable was put on the state protected list, people then all over Goa then started calling me and asking me about, oh, can I come and help them put some monument or some hall, comunidad hall, onto the state list? And I was like, you know what? It's not like I had any more information than anybody else. What I did was the information I had, I gathered it, I worked with scholars, and then I brought it out to the community. And it's the community that then fights for these things to be added onto the list. But the feeling was like the people I spoke to was that, oh, maybe you know something that we don't know. And this is something that Goa's archive and archival history has this complexity is that it's located in three or four archives or maybe five archives because sometimes like the entire archive was moved to Brazil and then part of the archive went missing and then some was shipped back to Goa, some was shipped to Lisbon. You need to have also transnational collaborators if you are going to write Goa's history. What we did was a brief archival study. We made this report and we began studying this monument where very little existed on site. And we began marking the terrain based on the sites of today, in the sense of the terrain keeps fluctuating with change in the political regimes. And we began then looking at maps and also marking the historical nature of the village itself. This is Chimbel village. And what we start beginning to have is an archive of the village. Okay, there's a lot of history that's not written down. And going through the archives, etc., you have manner in which architect then can draw up a history of a place by looking at the archives. And many a times you have to read against the grain of the archive because it was recorded by colonial officials. And colonial officials have their ways of seeing things, etc. And if you look at the maps closely, you will see less amount of houses because houses were not seen worthy of being mapped, but you will see roads, government offices, infrastructure, churches, the big infrastructure of the village. But this is a map of 1860, and we were able to like then begin piecing together village history. And then we started looking at the terrain differently because we had this series of maps by which then we could then begin piecing the history of this site together. So when we first went to Google Earth, this is all that existed. It was a modernist building, and behind the modernist building was this massive jungle, like literally jungle. And once upon a time, this was a very important historical site for the village, right? The important part of doing research, looking into the archives, mapping and publishing is that research has to be the starting point of any social movement. This is something I have come to realize in Goa specifically, because a lot of Goa's history is oral history also, and a lot of myth and contestation of myths and caste struggles, etc. When you begin writing a history, it is something that is accessible, it is something that can be contested, but it is putting out academic research into the public sphere. The first point of organizing socially is use research as a starting point. That's what we did. Okay, when you are mapping, and this is, I could also make an entire technical presentation of this process, but I will stick to the social sides and how one then begins using it as a means of socially mobilizing people. Goa has a lot of ruined sites because in 1830, the Portugal's civil war was won by the liberal king. And the liberal king then got rid of all the religious orders, and many of the religious buildings then became social, social infrastructure run by the state. And this happens across the terrain of the Lusosphere, Portugal, Goa, etc. In those days, my friend, 2004 didn't have access to a 3D scanner or a total station. He only had a theodolite, and he did this with such rigor. Like literally, he had to measure the distance between two triangles, pull a tape, do the trigonometric calculations, and then have a really accurate mapping of this site, the St. Augustine's site. And this was a really tedious process. But what that did was It put this monument, the reading of the monument, into the public sphere in contemporary times. It's like re-looking at the monument. So then we used a similar approach, and but now we had the access to technology, and we used a 3D total station. And each point that you see over here, you can maybe see 726 or 720, etc., is a coordinate thrown very accurately onto the existing facade. This is the process by which we began mapping the site. So it's a three-dimensional coordinate. And based on that coordinate, then you begin getting a reading of this site. So the site has a very rich social history. It even was visited by, it was so important that it was visited by Richard Burton, the famous British linguist, traveler, etc. We began piecing together the site and we started using LiDAR, sorry, not LiDAR, this total station, in order to begin looking at the archive and looking at the site measurements. We began then seeing what the site had to offer. And very little remained from what the original site was, but there was this reading that we were able to get. Okay, so this was just a purely academic research project that we put together, not being part of any social movement or anything. But what we did was looking at drawings, looking at the way in which similar geometry came together in other structures in Goa. We were able to then build a kind of reconstruction of what this church looked like. And also, when you have a good understanding of geometry, then you don't have to go spend endless amount of hours on site. You're able to then use geometry as a means of drawing basic geometry. If you take basic site measurements, then you know within a cylinder you can build this kind of Solomonic column. Because if you had to go and then drop a point on every curve, take a lot of time. So then the first thing we came up with was a reading of the site somewhat like this, because there were a lot of missing layers. And we conjectured and we came up with a reading something like this. And so we started publishing this research at various places, but we also started taking this research and going and talking to people in the village. So we were like, okay, we're not going to act like big experts over here. We'll just take whatever we have and we're going to ask people what they think about it. A good thing in community organizing is just have a bottoms up approach, offer professional support, and don't prescribe things to people. Yeah, if you want anything to be done, because then they come up with stuff that you would never be able to get access to. So this person then, because we had this kind of approach that we would approach people gently, etc., they brought up this photo album that this 90-year-old man had clicked in the 1970s, like late 1970s, before this structure collapsed. And that completely changed the nature of the mapping, because now you had evidence as to what this structure looked like through somebody's personal archive. It was not part of public information. But because we went out there, we were able to also improve on our research. And if you saw the previous slide and you saw what we were able to then build up on, is something completely different, is because of this approach that we took. So this was the first time I was like, wow, people have something to offer academically, though they're not architects or they're not also sometimes familiar with the history of this monument, but letters, photos, that all exists within the community. Okay. So then we got IRs and the heavy hitters to come, and this was the first time then we said, okay, now we have to contribute something back to the community. So again, we started putting these images out there, and people started saying, yeah, actually it should become a community space all over again. Such a wonderful space. But this image was made by Ayaz. So he put an image of celebrating Christmas in the ruins, etc. And people were very kicked about it. So then I did something else. I went to Google Maps at that point, and I just dropped a pin. I just dropped a pin, and then I put some photographs of the site. And when you just Google ruins Goa, this comes up. And then this became like a really popular tourist site. And the villagers were like, but why are you coming? There's nothing to see in the village. And they were like, oh, we saw this on Google Earth and we are coming. And then they were like, oh, wow. And then there was a certain pride that built up in the village also. They were like, okay, now we have to go and ask the government to beautify this site and beautify this site, etc. But this is not a rich village and not very, how do you say, not with many individuals living in the village. The next thing we had to do is make a journalist friend, is to get this information out to the larger public sphere. Is that okay? We've done our academic research. Now we've put that academic research into the local community, like we've had an outreach to the local community. And how is it we get the larger society to take notice of this? I consciously went and made a few friends with journalists, and then I made the effort of getting them to the site and getting them to write about it, etc. But I also took my research and I leveraged it. I said, see, this is the archive, this is the maps that we looked at. And I started leveraging the media with the images that one I got from the archive, but the images that Goa Collective was also producing, like Ayaz had done with the church facade. Okay. So then this was a completely forgotten site. Nobody was aware of it. But then more and more articles started appearing in the press. And the more the articles started coming in the press, the more like the community started organizing because they also felt a certain pride in these sites that generally didn't exist in this village. It was considered a poor village. The other thing about community organizing is that one should not try to, okay, then even if you've done fantastic research, etc., one should not try to be the only one going out into the community and then pushing your ideas onto them. It's always nice to build a team. And when you build a team, you have various people coming up with like different angles to your research and building upon it and making it their own also. What I started doing is I started giving this research to my friends, and then I was like, I'm not going to speak about it, you speak about it. So they used to go and then they used to put up this PowerPoint projector. This was in a church, I think, Leicester. And he used to start speaking. And then people were like, first it was just the research, then it was just some articles. But then when you started putting this research out there, like this rigorous research out there, and reaching out to people in a concerted manner, you started then building the frameworks of a movement. It's something I didn't realize, and this is not and something that has taken a completely different life altogether, as we will see later. So the other thing is one must also recognize as a person, say, of my background, is that I also come from a lot of privilege. So I'm not part of those village communities, etc. I've lived in Panjim all my life. And when you go into those communities, I won't say suspicious, but they're not totally welcoming of you because they always feel that there's these activists who come to the village, come up with great ideas and then abandon them and then move on. So it's important whenever you are building any sort of trust, you have to go there often. And when they call, you have to go. Leave everything and go, even if it means like whatever, missing engagements, missing this. Develop the trust of the community. And here you will see Ayaz. This was a shed somewhere in the village. So then he came up with his own reading of the site, etc. And then they were also like, oh yeah, fantastic, this, that. Why only religious? Let's make it a site for the entire community. So then, like, I got not a lot, but a few of my friends to come and do this. And this really began creating trust in the community. And then, so once you have your research, you have a team, you keep going to the site, you have to reach out to various stakeholders. You have to understand that in any political terrain, there will be various groups that either align with your ideas or oppose your ideas. But it's important to get the conversation going and just put the research out there. Okay. The local community is also a rich source of research and archival material. And apart from the photos I showed you, like a friend Lester, the other collaborator in Goa Collective, he literally at some point took a sketchbook and went to the deathbed of some people who could not like literally move. And then he started talking to them and he started sketching what they were saying. And then he was like, is it like this? Is it like that? So I made it a chapter in my book where he's just recording oral history and he's jotting down what they have to say. We're not agreeing, disagreeing, it's just an oral history. And we've put a couple of sketches. Maybe scholars in the future can dig into that and take that material forward. But we also did that kind of oral history mapping. Okay. The other important thing is to amplify people's voices and not your own. So when you are an architect and you have all this research that you build up, etc., it's then important to step behind, get that information to become part of the general thinking of the community by going and speaking to the community. And then they have to take ownership of that. They have to take ownership of that research. And that takes a lot of work from an architect. You have to also speak the local language sometimes. You have to speak to people who are hostile. Okay. So after we did all this, we started having this entire group that got together and they formed a trust. And with the trust, then they started asking for funds and they got out there and started fighting with every government official saying that we have the research, we have the research, this monument is important for our village. And they literally started barging into the government offices. And if you see this individual over here, so she's Anna Gracias, someone I work with, and we have like a close friendship now. But she's environmental activist actually, and part of many agitations in Goa. Once you get a figure like this taking over your research and forming a community of local stakeholders, then you have to just get back. You have to not, you have to stay in the background and be a supporting cast because in any political movement, you need the numbers. And architects might come up with research, but you have no numbers. And you will never have the numbers. The way society is structured, you will never be able to get 200 architects to go to the office of the town planner and demand something. Literally, if you get two, it would be great. So it's important to disseminate this research at the grassroots level and then move back. Okay. You also have to take this research and be generous in that sense. Give other scholars, if you've done that with due citations, etc., give them the work. So Prajal, I gave him the work, and then he is a historian, and we have our differences, but I gave it to him. But he has a great way of communicating with people, etc. And so he took this and again went into the community. He was not Christian, so he was able to speak to another set of stakeholders, etc. So it was not like only a kind of Christian-led thing because the people I generally spoke to tended to be Christian. So when you spread your research wide, then you are able to create this community-like support. Okay. The other thing very important is that you cannot, while this is very important to create this whole community that takes your research forward, numbers, etc. You cannot not reach out to the elite in that sense. So at one level, I was talking to like the local grassroots activists and the villagers, but I was also talking to prominent citizens, NGOs like Charles Correa Foundations, journalists, and I was just asking them for a simple favor. I used to ask them, can you just write a letter on your letterhead, like a physical letter, and send it to the minister? just send it. Say that you want this, that you've heard that the villagers are agitating, and you also think that it should be part of the list of protected monuments. But I went. If they didn't have the time, I sat with them and I typed the letters for them. And then we just like physically posted those letters. And then we started like a parallel social media campaign. We began putting this site on Goa Heritage Action Group, other social media sites, etc. So people then all over Goa started taking notice of this. We also like had talks in these architectural forums, etc. And then created this whole like body of awareness that was not only like grassroots, but also reached like powerful actors, influential actors in that sense. Okay. The other thing is, it's very important if you ever are part of any social movement, etc. You always have to be on call and you have to show up. It doesn't matter. If they call you, go. It's very important. Okay. These activists then began like having 200 people, 250 people at their meetings. And when you have meetings of 200, 250 people, the local MLA then cannot really ignore you. And this is a photo of the activist talking to the local MLA, but they called him on site and like physically cornered him. It was that kind of meeting. And I was totally surprised at where this project began and where it started going. Like, I thought, like, I didn't expect 200 people to be gathered at the panchayat and cornering the minister, etc. But also then as I said, it's important to take your research and collaborate with other people who then begin writing about it in the public sphere, but writing about it in a academic manner. Okay, but through social outreach. Okay, very important. Your research and your cause is only as good as the number of people, and the it's only as good as the people you can mobilize, in the sense of the commitment has to come from your commitment. It has to come from your engagement, etc. And with that, then the numbers begin getting created. But if you go and start talking in the first voice, you will reach nowhere. Okay, so now a trust was formed. This group of mainly Christian individuals then begin asking for this monument to be protected. Okay, but they reached out to the local tribal community. They said, we need your help also. We need some numbers in order to whatever, go to the chief town planner's office. We need your numbers. It's important to also understand your social location. So I am Christian, and it's easy for me to talk to like my own community. But in order to create this cross community solidarity, yeah, it's important to take people from the entire movement and talk to other people for support. And then this, I realized, then spirals into a statewide issue. Okay, so then they were going to build the mall. So this monument was declared as a state protected site, and they asked the tribal community for the help. When the tribal community then, whose numbers are much, much larger, but they are not a very politically mobilized or rich community, they are landless, were being displaced from their traditional grazing grounds. They got together with all the groups that they had helped in the past, the Shimbel group included. And this led to mass agitations across the state. And the state is on boil today is because they were going to build a mall in the vicinity of that lake, which is in the vicinity of my site, which was mapped. And this cross group solidarity now is threatening the stability of the government. So you can go to YouTube and you can see it. So what started off as like a grand success in declaring this site a heritage site, then the research, the kind of archival material that we got out was able to help other groups in their causes also. Okay. And lastly, in a community-led movement, you are bonded to it for life. If it's your research that they're working with, you should not have an exit strategy. You should be forever committed to that cause. Okay. So it's this site, the surrounding sites are so like politically hot at the moment I am forever called. And sometimes I'm teaching in Ahmedabad and they'll call and they'll say, you have to come because now they're building a parking lot on the ruins. But I said, it's a map site. They said, no, but the contractor has come. So then sometimes sitting in Ahmedabad, then I have to draw these things over the maps. You can see a parking lot over here and you can see the ruins in the background. It's important. So like, it's your cause as much as it's everybody else's cause. Okay, it's all about teamwork, building teams, and one has to be humble with your research and also do the outreach. Okay, so this is my success with this. One was building up this entire team, and this entire team then went and associated with another cause that I had written about in the village, and then I somehow have become the person associated with this village, though I have no connection with it, no family connection, no friends, nothing. But if there's anything, they call me. And then sometimes I'm like the arbitrator between two disagreeing parties. Okay, so this was my research. But I'll also touch upon, I don't know how much time we have. I haven't been looking at the clock. But okay, I want to touch upon the other work that I've done. And this is mostly assisting my sister. So my sister actually is a far better social mobilizer, organizer than me. So she has led this movement that has got international recognition. And it was COVID. And during the lockdown, like in the hard lockdown, the central government said Goa is going to get three projects. It's going to get a railway that runs a railway, a highway, and a transmission line. So the railway and highway was being enlarged, not because there was more traffic on the road. It was because Goa was becoming a coal hub. Adani had bought these mines in Australia and they were shipping it to Goa, and they are shipping it to Goa and transporting it across the Western Ghats into Karnataka where the steel mills exist. So, but they run through Goa's most important national park. And now this movement is her organizing and her team's organizing, but I also saw at close quarters, because we were living in the same house at that time, about how she went about it. This is, say, Al Jazeera is featuring this. It's became so successful. So she went about it in about the same way about how I went about it. So in order to get any infrastructure project built in Goa, built in India, you need to have a environmental assessment report. And that environmental assessment report is science fiction generally. It's because you get scientists from government departments who do a kind of match fixing of that report and pass all these infrastructure projects with flying colors. So what she did was, like how I collaborated with a friend, she collaborated with 18 scientists from all over the country because she has this network across the country, and they just wrote a academic paper slamming this environmental clearance that the government had given, purely academic, peer reviewed research. And she began mobilizing, being stuck at home. So what they started doing is they started going to court because the courts were operating online because you were not able to go into the street. So they started asking me, can you help us with our maps? So I was like, yeah, sure. I said, but what can I bring as an architect to the table here? Here you are 18 scientists from various different fields. And like, where can I come into this? They said, we need maps made. What I did then was like, I said, I'll give it a shot. I said, I've never done this kind of environmental map making in the past, but I said, whatever. I have a training as an architect and I'll look at what I could do. So then they filed a case. They filed a case in order to trap the government. And they started giving me data like this. Oh, but I can't show you the kind of maps that were submitted to the courts because that's sub judice. But this was the kind of data they started giving me. And I was like, what rubbish is this? You are not going to win any court cases with this kind of data. And so they were writing very rigorously, but I found that there was a massive gap in their ability to create maps. So scientists are really good at writing the reports, but when it came to the graphics, it was really poor. And like the scientific data to it, because they're not trained in graphics, they're not trained in landscape, reading the landscape contours. Those are architectural, those are things that are taught in architectural school. So then there was this highway being built to transport coal through the national park. There was this power grid being drawn, etc. So they started giving me the data. They started giving me GIS data. They started giving me other data that they collated. And then I was looking at this data and looking at it as an architect. Then I said, you know what, this is going nowhere. So I said, what I will do is I'll take this data and I will bring in the layers which I think is important. So the first thing I started doing was take this data from 18 scientists and looking at, so I have now with my previous project, etc., I have an archive that I'm building up of maps. On those, a lot of topographic maps, but also infrastructural maps. Based on that, me and two of the architects in my office, we like young architects with full of energy, we sat during COVID and mapped each and every road in Goa, okay, in 2021, every road. And so when you map every road in Goa at that level of resolution, like literally we zoomed in pixel by pixel, and then we started talking to the My Mole folks. We were saying this maps that you're giving us, this is what it actually looks like. This is what the Goa's road network looks like. And this is how you have to then start getting the information out to the courts. Because the courts, what they were doing, the courts were sending a Supreme Court panel. The Supreme Court panel was coming, talking to the government, talking to the activists, but they were coming up with really like nonsense maps, like really poor maps. And so they then, with this data, then they were able to go and get a higher resolution, a higher like data resolution to then go and argue their case with these panels. Okay, so it was, then what we started doing is not only mapping the data, but we started analyzing. We started analyzing the data and then we started putting it out into the public also, saying that Goa is actually two states. It is the old territories where the Portuguese landed in the 16th century and the hinterland, which is the new territories. It's the 18th century occupation of Goa. And tourism and what people's idea of Goa is basically the old territories. It's a very small part of Goa. The rest is a hinterland of mining, extraction. So you have two extractive industries in Goa, tourism on the coast, and you have extraction, any sort of mineral extraction, transportation, all this kind of mining dumps, coal dumps, all that happens in the hinterland. So with this, you start getting a reading of this, that the way infrastructure is laid out in Goa is that you have these two industries living side by side. One is like this consumption industry, that's the tourism industry, and one is the extraction industry. Okay, and more or less, this is the way Goa is structured. And the environmental destruction that you see is of a different nature. One is coastal urban related, and one is hinterland extraction related. Okay, so we started mapping the changes, doing our analysis, talking to the scientists, etc., and then also showing them that, through publicly available data, because we couldn't go out of the house at that time, is that all this infrastructure that you see being developed in Goa is susceptible to floods. Yeah, all the five-star hotels and sea rise is going to really affect the old territories of Goa, the tourism coastal belt really badly. Okay, so that's one, is that if you are an architect, and you are passionate about like working with the community, then you have to work with various actors, and you have to work with the researchers on one side, like you're talking to them, you're talking a different language to them. You're talking more scientific language, you're talking more about data, mapping of data, etc. But you also have to, one thing I've realized with this movement, why it's so successful, is because they are very confident about their data, but it is completely artist driven. But they take the data and they literally give it, like how I gave it to the local community, they give it to artists. And the artists then take it forward and create this whole imagery around the environmental destruction of Goa, which is enormously successful. So sitting in a room by yourself, one side scientists, one side artist friends communicating with me, this whole movement was formed that has got a lot of traction across in the international media. Okay, so now I don't know if Zai is sitting on the talk. Okay, so the Zai, yeah, okay, yeah. So this is what, so then I read the report and I was like, my God, this is the driest report ever. Now, how is it you're going to get this information out to the public? So then I reached out to two of my classmates. So Zai is world-renowned animator. And I told her, can you help? Or I asked her if she could make a graphic of the data in which the scientists wanted to get out. What I did was I took the report and I storyboarded it for her. And within this larger graphic that she has made, there is a series of smaller there's a series of smaller events that you will see that can be used by just cropping this image and going out to schools talking to kids about the impact of the railways, highway, and them piercing the Western Ghats. You will see things like landslides. You will see like areas abutting the road, areas in which the forest is denuded. But these are the scientists are writing all this stuff, and it's like really dense writing. So what an architect can do is act as an intermediary between the scientists and the artists. So storyboard this whole thing, and then this image is a series of smaller educational moments that can be then cropped. So I think there's also an image of where she's drawn me like trapping a bear. The thing of building roads in forest areas is that it gives poachers easy access to areas abutting the road to lay these traps and all these kind of things. But if you read the image carefully, there's a lot of this data over there. And so that was the image like Zai produced is absolutely amazing. But I reached out to my other friend who's an animator, but he has not worked in this field at all. So we had to, it's a really lovely animation. It's just 1 minute long. And after the talk, maybe you want to just have a look at it. It's 1 minute long, but we had such, because I was acting as an intermediary between the scientists and the artists in that sense. It is so evocative. It is about one bison talking to a boar, speaking about the death of his wife and killed by a train that was built through the forest. In 1 minute, the way in which he was able to communicate this idea is that they would literally just go play this clip in the schools, and kids used to be like, oh my God, how can you even do this kind of thing? Okay, so this is another movement then I've been associated with. And the part in which I worked most with them is with water, is because those were the maps that they were most deficient in. They couldn't understand landscape at all and the layers of the landscape. So then looking at topographical maps, etc., if you remember the first map they gave me and the kind of data then we were able to overlay based on what they needed to be transmitted was far more complex. And when you go with like such rigorous data, specifically to talk to court appointed panels, etc., it creates a huge impression. Okay, so we map, like how we mapped every road in Goa, we mapped every rivulet in Goa also. And how do you do this? You have to literally go and look at archival data, look at archival map, change in the topography. This is 1955. So I had archival maps of Goa of that era, and I was able to, with two of my employees, map this data at a very high resolution. Okay, and then we were just giving it to this group and helping them with it. And we were also showing them that when you map every rivulet that existed in Goa in 1955, and then you start having mining, how does that change the landscape? So what is happening in Goa at the moment is that it's a process that has been started in the 1950s of extracting minerals, but today it is building dams and whatnot in these areas. So the change in topography is something we were able to bring out and also show them that this area is extremely environmentally fragile. And it's not only like infrastructure projects, it's the kind of political nature of Goa in the way it is structured. Okay, so the most vulnerable parts of Goa are most susceptible to road infrastructure, transmission infrastructure, railway infrastructure, big dams, and this changes the hydrography on the upper reaches of the state. So the amount of water and the quality of water reaching the rivers is diminishing as the years go by. And this has led to a lot of issues around water. You're having water wars in Goa right now with this neighboring states, etc. And we are also able to then map. So we got this data from the MyMoline group. So from that peer-reviewed paper and the data they gave us, we were able to mark the entire spine of mineral extraction that was taking place in Goa. So it literally bifurcates the state. So you have the water flowing from the higher reaches to the lower reaches, and you have this extraction taking place over here. So it's important to put the data out, take that, make that data more readable, and make it at a higher resolution. So then we were able to come up with graphics to show the manner in which, based on the mining pits, there is this change in the hydrography of the state. Okay, so Goa's backbone is a series of wildlife sanctuaries in the Western Ghats, which is a UNESCO protected site and among the most biodiverse regions in the world. But it's important to map the data in order to see where these layers clash with each other. Okay, when you put data out like this, you get artists, animators, public. So they are able to mobilize at a much larger level because Goa's environmental movement is so grassroots, whereas its architectural community is nowhere mobilized like the environmental movement. So they were getting 10,000 people. If here we were getting 200, they were getting 10,000 coming on the road, agitating, saying that they didn't want coal, they didn't want the highways barging through the Western Ghats, and they didn't want the railways going through. So one side is research, other side is publishing that research. Then you have to disseminate that research, but then you also have to put that pressure on the ground for change to happen. Okay, absolutely. So as it stands, the Supreme Court panel has seen the kind of force on the ground that Goa's environmental movement can bring, and has kept these projects on hold for now. Okay, but they are surreptitiously being pushed. So it's like in Chimbel, like in Mole, etc. There's no finality to these projects. You always have to be part of the game. Okay. Finally, wait, I'll just check the time.
We're good, Fernando.
We're good? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Finally,
We have another 6 hours.
no, I have this. I had another one, but I said I'll stick to three. So I will just now. How can architects then make this Shimbel agitation was a statewide agitation. This old Goa thing has reached the national parliament. So again, now how do Goa is a really small state, and then for these movements to get national recognition in parliament, etc., is requires a fair bit of sophistication on part of the activists, you know, in mobilizing themselves. It's very well mobilized. Okay, so a simple thing like this. So you have a monument, a national monument all across, like you have national monuments all across the country. And the monument has to have a buffer zone, a 100-meter buffer zone and a 300-meter regulatory zone. And a lot of these activists have been asking for this since the 1970s because the law vaguely said that it has to have it. But in 2010, the law specifically wrote that you have to mark it. Okay, so then how the state government absolutely doesn't want to put this buffer zones around the monument because it means that highways, railways, real estate all get trapped because they cannot build in these regulatory zones. So the state government absolutely is against this. So then how did map making help get us here? And okay, so again, as I say, you can only reach out to those who you are closest to. And then you have to, together as a group, create solidarities across activist groups. Okay, so Old Goa is a Christian site, but Safa Masjid is a very old 16th century Islamic site in the vicinity of Ponda Taluka. National monument again, with this beautiful Bijapuri tank. And if you see in front of Safa Masjid, you have a four-lane national highway within it's touching the compound of the Safa Masjid. Now this has happened in 2014. It's happened in 2014, and because you don't have that regulatory zone marked around this national monument, the Highways Authority builds what is easiest to them for them. Whereas if this regulatory like marking was there, you could go and challenge it in court. Okay, so it's very important to have this on statutory planning maps so that it can be legally challenged. You have grounds to stand on. So how is that done then? Okay, so the thing I learned in 2026, in 2006, I began working in the same way. So what I started doing was, so they came to me again. They said, we need your help. We don't understand. We know that the regulatory boundaries have to be put. But if we go to the ASI, they just stonewall us. We need your help getting these zones marked. So I said, I'll do this. I'll help you all. But you all go and fight. I said, you all go and fight. Any technical work you'll need, I'm there. I told them. So we started with this very simple graphic. The thing I learned at the start of my career. Just put out the images. So we just put on image of Old Goa Vision 2050. Again, COVID time. Huh? So we had some time on our hands. And then we gave it to them, and then they started sharing it on their WhatsApp. And they started sharing it. They started taking printouts, going and telling the ASI by not marking the regulatory zones, this is what is going to happen, this, that. And so they had an image to fall back on. And so, yeah, that is a way of something I learned 20 years ago, and then I applied it over here. But then again, community outreach, I also made the effort to go and talk to the various communities that existed in the vicinity of Old Goa, okay, in the vicinity of the monuments. And on a map that existed, we just dropped pins on where the historic sites. Okay, so we dropped these basic sites, and then we said, oh, does it fall in your personal property? Don't damage it. There are ways of working with the ASI. You can be monetarily compensated, etc., etc. But the first thing was creating this map and going out and talking to people. Okay, so then we started showing them, okay, these are the important sites. This is what exists today, what existed in the past. And as you would have had, there is the spokesperson of the BJP, Shaina NC. She builds a compound, she builds a house, a massive house on the river with this fantastic view, literally in the touching the compound of one of these churches. Now, this didn't require any mapping, it didn't require anything because you had this bungalow now. Forget the highways. Now you're having like real estate development coming over here. So this exploded. It means people were saying, because y'all have not put these regulatory zones around the monuments, this is what is happening. And because she was a powerful figure in the national government, this started getting traction in Delhi. Can you imagine? It's like Mahua Moitra was like speaking about this in parliament. So this was new. So when that happened again, then people got together. People got together, and then you started having large gatherings of people saying that we need these regulatory zones marked. So then the ASI shrugs the shoulder and says, yeah, we've done it. And we've given it to the state government. It's their job to put it on the statutory maps. Our job is only to mark the maps. So then, again, it comes down, what is your role as an architect in this? Your role as an architect is to take this data and look at it in a socio-legal way. In what is marked, what can be challenged in court, what needs to come on the maps. In this period, me and a group of friends then did a rigorous study of the landscape. We said we have access to Old Goa. Let's study Old Goa, but let's make it a statewide thing. Let's apply to all the monuments, all the religions, all the civic sites. But let's start with the data we have access to. So we mark the regulatory boundaries, we marked the watersheds, we looked at the entire site with GIS, etc. And also started realizing is that once you have this massive highway cutting the site and you have real estate development on top of the site, all the volume of water that is supposed to be absorbed by a lateritic plateau then starts coming down into a heritage precinct. So when you have maps like this, then you are able to go in. So the basis of all this was we had the data, we created this report, but this is not very accessible to the public. This kind of graphic, if you show it to the public, they'll be like, what is this? We can't understand what you're trying to say, etc. So the job of an architect is to take data then and work in two directions. One is the social legal direction, and the other one is public outreach. Okay, we created these maps, we looked at the watershed, we looked at where the highways were coming, where the boundaries were marked, etc. And the social groups were able to take this. This is a huge report that we made. They were able to take this and go to their Supreme Court lawyer in Delhi, who then got a Supreme Court panel to come to Goa. And the Supreme Court panel, I think a couple of months ago, has said that this site has to be demolished. And this is a kind of ruling party, like spokesperson, so very powerful individual. But it's this kind of grassroots mobilization that there's a great power that an architect has, as long as you are able to talk to people, help being part of the group rather than trying to be the face of the group. Okay, so one is the scientific data. Second is it's always nice to communicate then with the public. Just get your Instagram going, or get your projector and go and talk to people. Put the animations out there, put the graphics out there, and tell them what the issue is. So you have this site, you have the river, you have this watershed that is coming down, and you tell them this is the past, this is the present, and you tell them if the Kadamba plateau the plateau above this site gets concretized, you're going to have this kind of flooding. So when you go and you talk to people, they make your data their own. And so then they also come to you for suggestions. They come to you for suggestions. Okay, so what can we do? I work in the PWD, somebody said. Oh, no, rather WRD, Water Resource Department. What can I do as a government officer to come up with a solution which is not related to PWD infrastructure, which is related to water infrastructure? So then we identified plots, and then we created this animation that's saying that, you know what, the WRD has to just move their statutory lines to say that around this canal they have right to access to this property, that it falls in the watershed, so that in case there were floods, there was a catchment in which this area could flow into. And so then the activists then started going and harassing the WRD department, saying that you declare this as a catchment, in the sense of declare that as a catchment line, so that tomorrow a builder can't, though it is private property, tomorrow a builder can't just come there and start building in that watershed. So we were able to make graphics like this, and graphics like this are easier to communicate. You're able to better communicate to people in that sense. Okay. We also came up with ideas for them. We said it's a private property. The owner has to also make some money. It's close to the historic sites, etc. And then we made these graphics, etc. And then we pulled up examples from Japan, in which you had these landscape parks which floods and they become something else. They become accessible playgrounds, etc. And we just put it out there. We just put it in Photoshop. We went and we told them this is what has to be done. Very simple images in Photoshop. You can see some of those churches in the background, etc. And we said, make this catchment an area that floods. When it floods, the berms become a playground. Bus. No more, like you see people walking on this. And you can do it very cheaply. You can work with the owner of that site. Everything doesn't have to be built. Yeah, so then when you put things out like this, people start taking notice. And then the press starts writing about it. Yeah, so the press starts writing about it, etc. And it becomes part of the social discourse. With that, not only has the central government recently said that all of Goa. So then lastly, I created all this. Finally, they came up to me and said, are you willing to go and talk to the member of parliament from South Goa? He's in the opposition, but he doesn't have a clear understanding of what needs to be asked in parliament. So I said, I'm willing to go, but I said, I'm willing to go if you all come. So they said, yeah, of course, he's willing to meet us, but we want you to do the talking. We want you to do the talking, and we want you to write a letter to him stating our position. So I said, I will not only write a letter, I will get 6-10 prominent citizens to look at these graphics and write a letter. So we wrote this letter, and he asked me, you draft. So there were a lot of people in the room, and they told us, and he just said this, don't take photographs and don't put it on social media before parliament starts, but tell me what I should ask. So I went and we wrote a whole draft. We sat across the table. That was put in the national parliament. The reply from the minister was, all the buffer zones have been marked and across all of Goa, and that is now statutory law. But if you didn't have these reports, if you didn't work with the community, this would go nowhere. It would just be a very great idea. And yeah, so thank you. I think I've spoken a lot. No?